I want to get into this question that Michael Tomasky writes about in today's New York Times. He asks this question in the headline. And I think it's something that we really need to grapple with and is getting virtually no coverage in the electronic media and no honest or serious discussion anywhere that I can find. And frankly, has not even been brought up once in the Democratic primaries, or at least in the Democratic debates, and I think should become part of the Democratic debates. And the question is, do the Republicans even believe in democracy anymore? It seems to me that what has happened here with the Republican Party is that it has become a faction of billionaires. I mean, this is billionaires, white racists or frightened white people, and misogynist people, and that's kind of it. Nixon started this with his Southern strategy in 1972 or 1968 rather. The Southern strategy, and then it got amplified in a big way, with Reagan and bringing in the billionaires. And saying, okay, the Republican Party is now officially the party of the very, very, very rich, or at least the right-wing very rich who are willing to support it. That's now the Republican Party. But that wasn't quite enough. And so they brought in the anti-abortion folks. They bought the fundamentalist Christian, particularly the TV preachers, the guys, hey, I need $54 million to buy a new jet. God told me that. Bringing those people and their followers in. And bringing in the people who are afraid that the jackbooted thugs from the government are going to come and take their guns, and they've cobbled together this weird coalition that even in sum total is not enough to win elections. And so instead, what they're doing is massive voter suppression. Their billionaires are coming in with massive campaigns filled with lies. The example, I talked about this in the first hour briefly, living here in Portland, Oregon, and it's great to be back home, by the way, and back in my own studio, although I had a great time on the road. And thanks again, tip of the hat to all the great folks at our various affiliated radio stations who hosted me during the book tour. But the Republican Party has basically put this thing together where they're saying, what we're all about now is suppressing the vote, aggressive gerrymandering. We saw in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, states controlled by Republicans, just prior to the 2016 election, you saw hundreds of thousands of people, of legitimate voters, largely African American and Hispanic and Asian, removed from the voting rolls. You saw the same thing, over 1 million people removed from the voting rolls in Georgia when Stacey Abrams was on the ballot. The result, of course, was that the Republican ended up winning. Republicans increasingly are relying on structural stuff. In North Carolina, for example, the vote in North Carolina is about 50-50. In terms of who they want representing them in the U.S. House of Representatives. And North Carolina has, as I recall, 13 members of Congress. I might be off on that. But basically, they're ending up with 9 or 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats with a 50-50 vote because of gerrymandering. And then the Supreme Court last week said, political gerrymandering is just fine. Racial gerrymandering, no, you can't do that, but political gerrymandering, just fine. So they're just going to start using the language of politics rather than the language of race to do the exact same thing, knowing that there are political divisions that are also racial divisions. I mean, John Roberts and the right-wingers on the court just opened the door. And so now you're going to see hundreds of frankly, I think it's going to be billions of dollars, not hundreds of billions, but I think it's going to be probably over $1 billion in this election cycle being poured into state legislatures and state governors' races, because whatever party is in power after the 2020 election, because of the census, this is in the Constitution, every 10 years you take a census, and then in the following year or two, based on that census, you redraw your congressional districts so that they reflect where people have moved to or where people have moved from. Places that have fewer people, they have to, expand or change their, people who have more, places that have more. And states that actually gain or lose population overall can actually gain or lose a congressional seat. Now, of course, the citizenship question was designed to really whack the states that have a lot of Hispanics in them. But, the Supreme Court threw that out, although I think a lot of the damage has already been done. But this goes even beyond that. So we've got this extreme gerrymandering that's going on. None of this stuff has anything to do with democracy. And I think the reason why is because the Republicans have literally no plan for America. They want to do away with Medicare. They want to do away with Social Security. They've been singing that song since the 1930s about Social Security, since the 1960s about Medicare and Medicaid. They just don't, they think it's socialism. They don't think it's the government's role. There's very few Republicans who will just come right out and tell you this, but this is how they all vote. And what they're saying, they want to privatize Social Security, so that $2.5 trillion trust fund will go to the big banks in New York who fund Republican campaigns. They want to completely privatize our health care system and do away with Medicare and Medicaid, so that the multi-billion-dollar health insurance companies that give big money to the Republican candidates will get more. And the story I was telling earlier in the show was because we live here in Portland, we get ads for Washington State, because one of the largest cities in Washington State, Vancouver, is literally right across the river from us. You cross the bridge between, over the Columbia River between Portland and Vancouver, and you go from Oregon to Washington. So in the Portland television market and radio market, you're getting ads that are being paid for by groups in Washington State. Well, Jay Inslee 2 years ago got a carbon tax on the ballot. And it was very popular when it was first put on the ballot. And then the fossil fuel industry came in, and they dug up this old former Republican, I believe he was the Secretary of State, who looks and talks like Mr. Rogers. He just seems like the sweetest guy around. And in the ads, he never mentions the fact that he was the Republican Secretary of State. And he says, this carbon tax is just going to destroy the economy of the state of Washington. People are going to lose jobs because of this carbon tax. Well, in fact, that was not the case. It would actually create jobs. It would create a lot of jobs. And it wasn't going to raise the cost of living for Washingtonians. A lot of it was going to be refunded right back to them, particularly people who drive a lot. But because these dark money, these corporations were able, because of the Supreme Court rulings, particularly Citizens United, they were able to pour millions and millions of dollars into this. And the good government folks, people like you and me, were like, well, man, I think I saw 3 ads in favor of the carbon tax, and every single hour, every ad block had this, Mr. Rogers guy telling the people of Washington, be afraid, be very afraid. And of course, it went down in flames. And then you get Chuck Todd on NBC saying to Jay Inslee, well, your own state voted down your policies. Well, no, I mean, it's yes, that's what happened, but it wasn't because the state didn't like their policies. It was because a former Republican and a bunch of oil companies lied through their friggin' teeth to people, with millions and millions of dollars. I think it was a $20 million, ad buy. So how do we deal with this if you've got an entire political party representing about half the political spectrum that literally doesn't believe in democracy? That thinks that, they're the only way that they can win, because they have no good ideas, because the ideas that they do have are largely hated by the American people. They want to destroy labor unions, destroy the labor movement. They want to keep the minimum wage at $7.25 an hour. Which is it's never been. We've never had a period of time as long as right now during which the minimum wage was not increased. This is the longest stretch ever. Why? Because Republicans. And you've got, an absolutely immoral guy, Mitch McConnell, who stole a Supreme Court seat from our nation's first black president. And now the court is handing down these decisions like saying, oh, yeah, gerrymandering, that's just fine. So how do we deal with this? In his article, Michael Tomasky, he talks about this thing called competitive authoritarianism. He says, is there a middle ground? It was written by the Stephen Levitsky, who also wrote How Democracies Die. And the competitive authoritarianism. It's civilian regimes in which formal democratic institutions exist and are widely viewed as the primary means of gaining power, but in which incumbents' abuse of the state places them at a significant advantage vis-a-vis their opponents. And he said, and he talks about how this has happened in Mozambique, in Kenya, in Cameroon, in Taiwan, in Malaysia, in Cambodia, in Russia, Belarus, Ukraine. All of these states have basically lost their democracy and become these kind of quasi, semi-authoritarian states. And this is the direction the Republican Party is pushing us. What do we do about this?